Hey peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 3 of the Butterick 6018 sew along, and we're going to be making and setting in the sleeves. So let's get started. We're on to step 20, which is ease stitch upper edge of sleeve between small circles, and that's going to be running a line of long gathering stitches, and I like to do one at 3/8 of an inch and then one at 3/4 of an inch, which is just outside of the stitching line, which means the gather should sit nicely between on the stitching line when you remove the ease stitches. So I'm going to do that, and then we can sew the side seam together, which I'll be doing with a French seam. I've sewn my 2 lines of gathering stitches, as I say, 3/8 of an inch away from the edge and then 3/4 of an inch away from the edge. So my stitching line, my actual seam line, is right in between those. It's quite difficult to tell with this fabric, but this is the wrong side on the inside here, and I have pinned the wrong sides together because I'm going to be French seaming the sleeve seam. So the first thing we want to do is pin the wrong sides together and then make a line of stitching along here at 1/4 of an inch. And I like to, with my, because my presser foot, the edge of my presser foot is 3/8 of an inch away from the needle. So what I do is move my needle over so that the edge of the presser foot means that the needle is now 1/4 of an inch away from that, and that's just a way of sewing a smaller seam but without having to worry about the fabric getting sucked into the stitching plate. So I'm going to sew at 1/4 of an inch on both of these and trim that down, press it, turn it inside out, press it again, and sew at 3/8 of an inch to enclose the raw edge, and we'll have a French seam, which I of course will show you all the steps for. Once I'd sewn my seam at 1/4 of an inch, I've trimmed it down so it's 1/8 of an inch. I'm now going to go and press this so that it's over to one side, and then going to turn it inside out and press it so this seam is nice and flat, pin it and sew it again at 3/8 of an inch, which will enclose this raw edge. So next step is to press. I've pressed the seam on the right side, I've then turned it to the wrong side and pressed it again so it's nice and flat, and I'm going to sew this at 3/8 of an inch and press the seam towards the back. Now the one thing you want to remember is if you moved your needle over, you want to move it back so it's in the central position. I've sewn the remainder of the seam at 3/8 of an inch and I've pressed it towards the back, and you can tell it's the back because it's the double notch in the sleeve there. So everything is nice and enclosed on the right side. So before we attach these to the bodice, we're going to finish the edge here. For view B it says turn up 1 1/4 inch sleeve hem, baste close to fold, finish raw edge, sew hem in place, easing in fullness if necessary, and press. I like to use bias binding, and I have very nice and pretty bias binding, so I am going to do that for the edge. I am going to allow visible top stitching on this one though, because I'm going to do the hem in the same manner, so I will show you how that goes on. Okay, so I have the right side of the bias binding, so the side that you can't see any of the raw edges on, to the right side of the sleeve. I've turned over about 5/8 of an inch of the bias binding, and that will just help us with a nice finish at the end. And I have lined up the raw edge of the binding with the raw edge of the sleeve edge, and I'm going to sew all the way around in this crease of this fold until I get to this end, and just again overlap the last part of the binding about the same amount and backstitch at the beginning and the end. So once you've sewn the bias binding to the right side of the fabric, you want to turn your sleeve inside out. So I've got the wrong side of the fabric here, and we're going to use our blind hem foot, which is because it has a nice guide here which you can keep straight with the edge of the bias binding. I've got my needle all the way over to the left, and with my right finger I push the fabric down, and with my left finger I roll the bias binding around, so that way we get a nice line of stitching that will keep the bias binding in place. Just keep maneuvering the sleeve around. Obviously it is a circle. You can trim any stray threads from the fabric when it's molting, when it's fraying, or you just tuck it under there because it's all going to get enclosed. So I'm coming back up to where I started. So make sure everything's lying nice and flat. And backstitch. Once that's done, we need to press our bias binding underneath so we have a nice finished edge, and top stitch it down in the same method that we've just done. So once you've pressed the binding under, and it will roll quite naturally so that you end up with just a little bit of the exterior fabric showing, we're going to use the same method to sew the hem. So our blind hem foot running up against the edge of the bias binding will give us a nice finished hem like this. So I'm going to show you with sleeve number 2, hopefully. It's always fairly interesting trying to do this with the camera in the way. So lower the presser foot, run the edge of the foot against the edge of the bias binding, back stitch at the beginning. You really want to make sure that everything's lying nice and flatly with this one, because you can end up with the fabric looking a little twisted if you're not careful. So you want to take your time, make sure everything's nice and flat. Just reposition. Okay. Getting round to the start. Careful that you don't get the guide on your foot caught on the edge of the binding or on the seam. Back stitch, and then we're done. So we're going to want to give this a press, but we'll do that when we come to the end. We'll just press everything nice and carefully, because again, you don't want to make your fabric shiny, which is something that I'm finding with this polyester fabric that I got from the textile centre. I'm finding that it does need a lot of heat to press well, but it also, if you put a lot of heat on it, it does go shiny, so I'm being careful of that. Step 30 is view A and B with right sides together, pin sleeves into armhole, placing large circle at shoulder seam. Now for me, I rather than draw in the large circle or try and remember that, I just do a notch and clip into the seam allowance to indicate the top of the seam, which is going to match up with the shoulder seam. Adjust ease and base, stitch again at 1/4 of an inch, 6 millimeters away in seam allowance, trim close to stitching, press seam allowance flat, turn seam towards sleeve. Now I've got 2 layers of fabric in my bodice because I have the outer and the inner, and I have basted those together at 3/8 of an inch the entire way around. I am very tempted to do a French seam, but that could end up being quite bulky, especially in the areas where we've got the seam allowances, because we're going to be adding in the sleeve, which is another layer of fabric. So I'm quite tempted to use bias binding to finish this edge, which is not something that they're recommending here. They just want you to do 2 lines of stitching and cut up to the second line of stitching. So I think I'm going to use bias binding to finish my armholes. We need to get the sleeves, and we need to line up the front of the front notch and the back notch, which is the double one, if I can find it. Again, doing this through the viewfinder. So yeah, this is the back, the double notch, and this is the front. So we need to get the right sleeve going into the right hole, and you want to have right sides together with the sleeve, so it helps to have the bodice inside out and the sleeve the right way out. I like to use a lot of pins. I'm not sure if you can tell. The area that is meant to be gathered down is quite small, so I have put a lot of pins in here, and I'm going to very carefully ease things as I go so that I don't end up with any tucks or puckers in my seam. You want to be sewing with this is the sleeve and this is the outside, and you want to be sewing the sleeve side under your presser foot so that you can see that, because this is the area that you need to control. Go slowly, be careful, ease everything in, fingers crossed it'll work. We shall see. Okay, so I've sewn my sleeve in, and now I need to remove the line of ease stitching that I made at 3/4 of an inch. Right, finally got that ease stitching out of the way, and we have a nicely set in sleeve which has got no tucks in it. There is obviously kind of ease in the sleeve cap, but that's what you want, and I haven't pressed this yet. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to trim my seam down to the just inside of, leaving the stay stitching that I did, or the basting that I did to attach the lining to the outer fabric of the main bodice. So this is the sleeve under here. I'm going to trim it all down to about 1/4 inch away from that, just so that I can put the bias binding on and it's not too bulky under the arms. So I'm going to trim all of this away. I've used the same method to sew down the bias binding as I did to finish the hem. It was a lot more difficult because it's a very tight space, because you've actually only got the way you need to get it under the presser foot, you've actually only got the opening of the arm to kind of work with, so it is a very tight fit. You could also slip stitch it down by hand if you wanted to, but I'm going to give it a good press, and we want it to be lying in towards this sleeve. As ever, if you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section down below, and I will do my best to answer them for you. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I will see you again very soon.